In pre-modern times, ideas of wind and breath often became the basis of ways of understanding the universe. Wind in the external world is often seen as related to breathing within the human body.
Wherever you're joining us from all around the world, and panelists from all around the world too. Welcome to the Buddhism and Breath Summit. My name is Pierce Salguero, and I'm a professor at Penn State, specializing in Buddhist medicine. And my co-host Francis Garrett is to my right on the Zoom grid here, and Francis from University of Toronto. And on behalf of both of us, I want to welcome everybody to the summit, both the panelists that you see on the screen, as well as all of the attendees. Our program for today, we're going to just start out with some brief introductions. And then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion with the panelists based on some pre-circulated questions that we sent out to panelists in order to sort of identify some connections and some common themes between their research in various different areas. But then we're going to open the floor for Q&A from the audience and for the panelists to ask each other questions, and that's going to be at least the whole second hour, possibly a little bit more. And because that's really what we want to prioritize is fostering a conversation here between everybody. I'm going to turn the floor over next to Francis to sort of do the formal introductions. But just before I do that, I just wanted to say real thank you to all of the panelists for putting together some really amazing, informative and really useful presentations that are all now posted to the website jivaka.net, jivaka.net, under the Buddhism and Breath tab. We have all 13 of the presentations there. The panelists have pre-viewed those before coming today. Francis and I have seen them as well. And we invite you to also take a look at those, and I think will help. Anyway, my dog's about to bark, so I'm handing it over to Francis.
Thanks so much, Pierce, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm Francis. As Pierce said, I'm zooming in from University of Toronto, where I teach Buddhist studies and Tibetan studies. And I'm just going to say a few words about how this event came to be. So as a researcher, I'm mainly a historian of religion and medicine in Tibet. And so the topic of breath as an area of practice and theory that crosses those disciplines has always been of really great interest to me. But in recent years, we've seen an explosion of popular interest in the power of breath and manipulating the breath. And there are more and more popular books coming out, such as, I have just a few examples right in front of me, such as Dan Brûlé's Just Breathe, or very well-known Patrick McEwen's The Oxygen Advantage, or James Nestor now has a New York Times bestseller called Breath. And I just learned about this one, I think it just came out, called Breathtaking by a pulmonologist. So, and this is only like a few. I've got a whole shelf at home on these books. But from my perspective, as I started looking through these, what was missing in many of these books was a real engagement with or understanding of even the very rich and varied ways that breath has been understood in and used in Asian traditions throughout history and across cultures. So I wanted to start sort of addressing that gap. And I started last year by teaching an undergraduate course called Biohacking Breath at the University of Toronto, where we explored together a lot of the existing English language academic work on breath in Buddhism in particular. But even there, I felt like There was so much more to say and so much more research potential than what's already published in these academic spheres. And so then this year we decided to convene this gathering to start looking into how people are thinking about and working with this topic. So with the talks that are presented online on jivaka.net, and then the associated reference resources and reflection questions that go along with each of those talks, I'm hoping that we can bring this historically and culturally really rich body of research to a wider audience. And I'd like to say too that I hope this is just the beginning. I'm looking forward to continuing to build the resource on jivaka.net. So I don't want to take any more time from our conversation, but before I turn it back over to Pierce, and maybe then we'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, I'd like to thank Pierce and the Jivaka project for hosting today's event and the online resources. And I also want to thank the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Toronto for sponsoring the event. Yeah, so we were thinking maybe very brief introductions from the panelists. Everybody has a bio that's up on the website, and so if you want more information about them, you can check that out. And also, with so many panelists, it may take up all of our time if we each give our sort of full introduction. So maybe just a circle around with everybody's names and institutions or affiliations or workplace, and
Hi, everyone. I'm Saskia Abrams-Kavanenko, and I'm based at the University of Copenhagen in the Center for Contemporary Buddhist Studies. I'm part of a project looking at Buddhism and waste. I've written a book on air pollution and how it relates to Mongolian Buddhist ideas and enlightenment.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nabakadon Kitiseni, a PhD student from University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm studying in history, but specifically focusing on history of Buddhism, especially the meditation tradition between Thailand and Cambodia in the mid-20th century.
Hi, I'm Susanna Dean. I'm just writing up my research from my British Academy postdoctoral research fellowship here at in the UK at the University of Bristol. And I'm looking really at Tibetan ideas about madness across kind of religious and medical notions of mind and body and the ways things can go wrong, essentially, and be fixed again in that context.
Good morning. My name is Michael Sheehy. I'm a research assistant professor and director of scholarship at the Contemplative Sciences Center at the University of Virginia. And my interest is in studying Tibetan contemplative practices.
Hi, my name's Dave Collins. I'm a longtime practitioner of primarily Buddhist practices, Soto Zen, and in recent years, jhana, absorptions through the breath, which is in for this invitation to join y'all. And at the intellectual level, interested in cross-cultural parallels in contemplative techniques. Specifically, I've looked at the Christian author of The Cloud of Unknowing and Opposite Side of the World, very different vocabulary, but very similar processes of meditation in Dogen, Soto Zen. And then those two authors, similar edits over time. They're learning the same thing.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Tom Patton. I'm here in Hong Kong at the moment, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at City University of Hong Kong, looking specifically at Buddhism in Myanmar.
Great. Did you say the City University of Hong Kong?
No, I wish.
Just kidding. Dave Wells.
My name's Dave Wells. I work full-time as a yoga therapist in an integrated pain management clinic in upstate New York. And then a part-time job, I provide continuing education for yoga teachers, yoga therapists, and massage therapists.
Great, thank you. Kin.
Hello, everyone. Kin Chung. I'm assistant professor at Moravian University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And my work is in contemporary Buddhism. I'm interested in how Buddhists debate ethics, about their medical healing practices, and also their engagement with economics and capitalism.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nathan or Jishin Mishan, and I'm currently in the US in Michigan, though I was supposed to be at Ryukoku University in Kyoto, Japan, just long delayed entry due to border closures. And I'm both a Shingon priest and practitioner in the Shingon tradition, though also combining and using long time Thai forest tradition practice. But academically and professionally, also a chaplain and studying Buddhist chaplaincy, anthropologically and sociologically, and especially looking at the development of Buddhist chaplaincy in Japan.
Hi everyone, my name is Ronit Tioeli Tlalim. I'm based at the History Department at Goldsmiths University, London. I've been working mostly on history of Tibetan medicine in the last few years and the transmission of medical knowledge on the Silk Roads. And I've also been part of the Life of Breath project that was based at Bristol and Durham University.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anne Klein. I am professor of religion at Rice University and a co-founder and head teacher at Dawn Mountain. And my interest has long been in theories of mind, epistemology, and particularly for some time now in contemplative studies through the lens of Buddhist philosophers and epistemologists. Sort of the interaction of head and heart, I think of it. And very mostly within Gelugpa and Nyingma traditions is where I'm working with a particular interest in the last, 10 years or so in Dzogchen. Happy to be here. Hi. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anne. So we have the very, very typical situation in a webinar where one of our panelists is stuck in the attendees group and we're trying to sort that out. If we're not able to, then we, I don't know, we'll come up with another solution. So, but for the moment, thank you everybody for all the panelists for introducing yourselves. And I just wanted to showcase for everybody here, including for the attendees also, that we made a point of really trying to pull in people from a lot of different positions within sort of the larger Buddhism and breath space. So scholars, practitioners, I think most people are scholar practitioners of some sort or another. Just really, we were a little bit Tibet heavy, and that has to do with maybe our social circles. But the intent was to bring together a wide range of people to be able to have a broader discussion beyond sort of the technicalities of any one particular tradition, and also to generate some materials online for both undergraduate students and also for the general public to be able to learn more about the role of breath in Buddhism. So that was kind of our intention here. So very much looking forward to actually hearing you all communicate with each other and communicate with us about some of the commonalities or some of the common themes, or maybe some of the differences that you find in between your various perspectives. So for now, we'll start with the pre-circulated questions. So I'll read the questions the way they were stated, and the panelists, you all can feel free to sort of interpret it in whatever way makes sense for you within your own kind of context, your own research, your own practice. But the first question that we had was about the fact that practices and technologies of breathing are becoming increasingly common in public spaces, particularly in North America, but also globally. But we note that few members of the public really have a chance to learn deeply about the culture and the religious histories and contexts for these practices. Some of the books that Francis held up presumably don't have a very deep historical analysis of the breath. I haven't read them, but I'm assuming that that's the case. So the opening question to all of you is just to see if you might think a little bit or share with us a little bit about why you think it might be important for either practitioners, contemporary breathwork practitioners, or members of the general public to learn more about these historical and religious contexts that you all have studied so deeply. So does it matter that they learn these contexts, and if so, why? And I'll just leave that question out there, and whoever wants to just unmute yourself and jump in, you're very welcome to. Don't be shy. Jump in, Kin. Yeah, no need for the...
Okay,
yeah.
Because there's so many of us, I don't want to interrupt anyone. So my initial thought is that it matters, and I want to share a recent experience. So I'm co-curating an art exhibition at my university, and my fellow co-curator, Kristen Baxter, who teaches yoga in pre-K to 12 classrooms. She also teaches art. And she says that yoga teachers really brush over the Asian roots of that practice very quickly. There's no room, or maybe because there's a lot of hesitation to talk about cultural appropriation. And so part of that, she says that there's no mechanism to talk about religion in public school spaces. And that's kind of her invitation for me to co-curate the exhibition, because I'm in the global religion department. And I said, there is a mechanism. The mechanism is religious literacy. And maybe those of us in the field of religious studies have failed to really make a point of how important religious literacy is, as important as digital literacy, financial literacy, et cetera. And so quickly, my answer to that question posed, why it's important, is the recent ruling in Alabama during May of this year that yoga can be taught in public schools in Alabama only if Asian words are not used. So you cannot use Asian words. You cannot say namaste. And so what does this cultural appropriation, this erasure of the Asian roots mean when we want to produce a secularized practice of whatever it is, yoga, mindfulness, breath, meditation? And so I just want to point out that one of the big things about religious literacy is if you study religion, then you'll know that secular and secularization is a construction, is an active process. It's not something to be taken for granted.
This is Dave. I'm reminded with Ken's observations how the word religion itself is a Western developed term. Sometimes it sounds esoteric, but it's mechanically matter of fact. Sometimes I meditate in my sleep, which tells me my waking, language-associated functioning is its own sort of culture or language. We all breathe, and in a somewhat poetic mode, I want to say we all sing. So for me, it's a both and. The cultural words, poems with which we express ourselves, through which we communicate our experience, are a richness to be celebrated and appreciated. And again, to repeat, we all breathe. It is not hard, while there's a great richness of contemplative meditative procedures across cultures, across continents. It's also not hard to find people doing very similar techniques, having very similar realizations. So I'm interested both in appreciating the poems through which we express ourselves and looking at the experiential, it can sound dry, but the mechanics, the beautiful mechanics of how we touch, reconnect, which is an etymology for religion, how we reconnect with the matter of fact, miracle and wonder of being alive and breathing.
I love the conversation so far. I'm just going to interrupt the flow for just a moment because we managed to get Nalika here through alternate means. So Nalika, do you just want to introduce yourself real quick and say just kind of...
Hello, everyone. Sorry I'm late. Thank you so much for the invitation to just be present this way. I'm Nalika. I'm a research anthropologist at the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at the University of Southern California, interested in issues of race, ethnicity, nationalism, and gender, and intersections with that with Buddhism.
Thank you. I'm really glad we were able to sort that out. So I'm glad you're here with us. So sorry. So please continue.
I guess I think it's important, broadly speaking, to help people out of monolithic thinking and the idea that everything comes in boxes. You know, I teach an introduction to Buddhism, and someone says, oh, I learned in high school that, you know, the Buddha was a human being. And now I'm reading something else. And, you know, just to pluralize, there is no such thing as Buddhism. There's no such thing as any particular, religion. There's subspecies. And that seems very important, especially nowadays, particularly in Alabama and places like that. You know, people, we all breathe, to David's point, but we think about it differently. And that's what's wonderful about studying the humanities. So it just seems very significant.
Yeah, Ronnie.
Just to follow on Anne's point, so something that came up a lot in the Life of Breath project is this exact idea of we all breathe, but we think differently about our breathing. And talking to medics who work with breathlessness people, and the difference that it made if the person was aware of some of Asian ideas about breathing, the connection between body and mind, and so that in itself enabled an opening up of ideas that had an effect on people's actual health and actual getting over breathlessness, especially breathlessness that didn't have a concrete physiological aspect. And we know that breath has so many aspects. So it's often what they call the medics unexplained breathlessness. And especially in those cases, opening up the ideas actually made a physiological effect.
Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think it's also really important to sort of understand where these traditions have come from so that you can understand why people are doing things. So why certain practices are kind of the way that they are. So, you know, I think a lot of you touched on this in your talks, that, you know, having this sort of sense of a greater purpose in this, you know, it's a radical reconfiguration of one's personality. I think it was Jeffrey that said that. So, you know, you have something outside of your own self that you're working towards. So I think that helps to really ground like the practices that people are doing and contextualize them in a way which can be helpful, especially when avoiding certain problems with, you know, touching on bliss states too much or so on. You know.
Partly to piggyback off of Kin's comments earlier, in mindfulness discussions, often I've heard even like almost no attribution to the Asian and Buddhist roots of mindfulness. It's like John Kabat-Zinn invented mindfulness, which obviously isn't historically true. And so just not to whitewash this history, but also to, I mean, mindfulness has been continuously being adapted in the US in Western culture for more than 100 years. And so there is a lot of history to that. And beyond that, when we pay more attention to this history, there's this treasure trove of information to make these practices more effective even, and to treat different things better. I'm reminded of a story. There was a talk, it was given in a mindfulness-oriented conference, and the speaker, Willoughby Brown, it was close to a decade ago, and she was presenting some of her research about some of the negative potential effects of certain meditative practices. And most of the room was very antagonistic towards the talk. Like, what do you mean that mindfulness can have negative effects? And the few historians and monastics in the room were actually like very supportive. Like, yes, this is the case. We've read it and known about this for quite some time. And the fact is just that there are so many different practices, and there's such a history of trial and error and going through all these practices and documented records through Japan and China and Korea and other places of how these practices have been applied in society for more than a millennia. And so when we access that history and don't ignore it, there's actually a lot of great information available that can even help move these fields forward, I believe, in many ways. And looking back at that and seeing, oh, these are how such practices were applied. Maybe we can try giving more nuance to this in our own applications. So there's just so much potential available in looking back into the cultures and histories of how these have been developed through time.
Nalika, yeah, jump in, please.
Hi, thanks. I'm going to piggyback on a few of you guys' comments. And I've been participating in a conversation with several Asian Americans recently who are practicing in non-Asian dominant insight meditation or Buddhist meditation spaces, and really learning how from these communities and practitioners, kind of the impact that it has had on them in the kind of whitewashing that Nathaniel was mentioning of being Buddhist, being Asian, oftentimes being convert Buddhist, however, but at the same time having and knowing that these are practices that come from one's own tradition or one's own backgrounds, and the kind of, in a sense, the triggering and the kind of disquiet that they experience in the type of whitewashing and the presentation of Buddhism as brought to the United States from these well-known white figures, when the traditions that it comes from have been kind of erased. And at the same time, not just that type of representation critique, but at the same time, a sense of loss from disconnection from the communities of practice, and that they themselves are recognizing that they came into these practices through mindfulness and insight and Western-based meditation centers, and thus this desire for connection to the heritage communities of practice, and looking to make those connections and seeing how their own practice and insights can develop as a result of that.
Yeah, thanks.
Following on Nalika's comment, I'm reminded how Christian circles have in ways been reminded in our generation of their own contemplative techniques through the popularity of things like transcendental meditation and Buddhist mindfulness practices, movements like centering prayer, building on the cloud of unknowing, John of the Cross, but with vocabulary also shaped by transcendental meditation and Buddhist practices.
Yeah. I think Michael was going to make a comment, and then Suzanne, I think you had one too, right?
Yeah, no, that's great. I also think it matters. Just to sort of build on Kin's initial comments about religious literacy, I would add a kind of contemplative literacy, right? What is it to learn how to go through certain movements, certain gestures of awareness of the body and so forth in ways that can enhance performance, different kinds of experience for different reasons. And yes, there are pathologies of meditation that traditions document, and Buddhist traditions document quite elaborately, at least the Tibetan traditions do, and counteractive practices for these pathologies that may arise into different kinds of practices. But there's also transformative personal benefits beyond the kind of soteriological benefits. There's health benefits. There's perspective taking and worldview transitions. There's relationships to one's body or self-image that occur. There are interpersonal relationships that go through transmutations. There's a greater groundedness in nature or sense of embeddedness in one's environment, a kind of contextualization process that happens. And again, all sorts of physical benefits, health benefits include just emotional resilience. Certainly stress reduction has been part of the popularization of these practices, increased feelings of balance, or what we might call homeostasis. But I also think that it's important to engage in these practices in the contemporary moment, because these practices, at least the Tibetan ones that I work with, but I would imagine many of us working in Asian Buddhist traditions, are under threat of extinction. Kind of cultural, historical forces have made these practices, many of them, really under threat. And I don't know how else to frame it. So by engaging in these practices, trying to understand them, perform them, contextualize them, embed them in our lives in different ways, and study them seriously, take them seriously as an object of study, there's a kind of preservation that happens. I'll also say, just because I think it was brought up in different moments in the conversation so far, that many of these practices are also cultural practices, right? They're deeply embedded in cultural matrices and are to be understood as so. To extract them and repurpose them is a complex process, as has been mentioned in processes of secularization. However, it's also important historically to understand these processes have gone through transmutations and will continue to go through transmutations. So as practitioners and scholars, how can we be aware of that, sensitive to that, and talk about them in that kind of embedded context?
Yeah. Great. So I think we'll do one or two more comments on this question before moving to the next one. Susanna, were you? Yeah, you're gonna.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just thinking how the situation is kind of particularly complicated by the kind of very diverse motivations and biases people, particularly Westerners, bring to these kind of practices. So I think I could probably go to a Buddhist meditation class or workshop, even in this kind of one city where I am now, and find some people that really want to emphasize the sort of religious or spiritual aspects of meditation, and other people that really, really want to kind of play that down and talk about, meditation just being about psychology or philosophy or whatever. And so those different kinds of interest, can lead to a lot of different kinds of cultural appropriation and a lot of different kinds of problems, whether that is, not doing practice properly, whether it's just kind of confusion, whether it's kind of really just misunderstanding the history and all the impacts of that. And obviously, one of the things that people talked about already is this issue of, the dangers, if you like, of practice going wrong and the problems that can happen if you're not doing your practices properly. So I think, even within small groups, you'll find these kind of differences in interests that lead to different ways of interpreting kind of meditation and the background. And that's even before you get into the kind of thing that Kin was talking about in terms of, particular programs, or here in the UK, doctors recommending mindfulness programs for depression and therefore not wanting to present it as a religious practice and things like that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that it can pan out, good and bad, as a result of those sort of different things.
Great, thank you. We'll go to Napakadon.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I would have kind of like three different patches of thoughts that may be speaking to one another. The first one, as I'm a historian, I would care about, how to contextualize what I'm studying. But from the standpoint of like the one who's like being a practitioner, working with meditation schools in Thailand, we are always, encouraged to avoid reading or studying something before we meditate or practice, because you will be preoccupied by those, Dharma lessons and thoughts, because we are always encouraged to, to experience the way it is before we try to understand it. Because this is like it's always happening in the guided meditation. That's the second thing I would like to point out. And the last thing is about when we have to work with people from various backgrounds and disciplines. Especially this semester, I helped teaching discussion sections for Introduction to Buddhism. There are several students from STEM discipline that maybe this is the first time in their life, learning about the Pali and Sanskrit, terms related to Buddhism. And sometimes they are struggling, with pronunciation, like pronouncing these terms and understand this term and so on. And it's my job to explain them and, sort of different things. But one thing that I always remind them is that, we learn about different traditions, even among the Buddhists. You may have been, exposed to different terms and terminologies, but remember principle, not examples. That's, the one of the priority that I would always encourage them.
Great, thank you. So I see that there's people that have more to say, but I want to bring the next question into play. So those of you who still want to comment on this particular point can either weave it into your comments for the next questions or put it in the chat, and we'll keep the conversation going in that way. I see that there's some chatting happening, and the Q&A has started to the questions have started to come in. So the attendees, please keep that coming our way, so that when it comes time to open the floor, we'll be able to get to those questions. So for the second question that we pre-circulated, not everybody's presentation focused on the medical applications of breath or wind, but many of them did. And many of those presentations pointed out overlaps between medical and religious usages or understandings. And so we wanted to sort of open the floor to that topic of discussion. Just what about the relationship between these models of breath or wind that are intended for spiritual development versus those that are principally intended for health and healing or medical purposes, and wanted to see if we could generate some conversation around that theme.
I have a comment from the previous, which leads well into the health topic. Reference to Willoughby Britton's work and how difficult experiences can be associated with meditation practice, especially intensive practice. It's also, of course, true, difficult experiences are associated with psychotherapy. I'm a psychologist, and again, parallels, if you open your heart, if you get real with what you're feeling, is that a contemplative practice? Is that a psychomedical practice? Your stuff is going to come up. Healing, not to be too trite about it, but healing can be a hard thing to go through. And personally, I very much applaud the integration of contemplative, meditative, mindfulness practices in healing practices. I personally have been sitting fairly intensively for over 40 years and have 3 graduate degrees in its study. And not to be too coy, but it's really clear to me I'm still learning. And so I can get a little uncomfortable when I get a sense that someone has decided conclusively what mindfulness is and how to use it. So a double message. Personally, I greatly encourage and am enthusiastic about greater familiarity with contemplative practices. But again, to be a little simplistic about it, I very much encourage a sort of humility on all our parts in learning about these techniques.
Some comments maybe from, I know several of you are practitioners of healing arts that use winds or have researched this topic. Any other thoughts on this question?
I guess one point I could add is it also just really depends how we understand the word healing and health. Because, for example, the Shingon tradition that I've trained in, and I know it's not completely unique to that form of Buddhism, but to go through and strive towards all the way to full awakening as the goal requires becoming aware of and understanding the deepest root causes of suffering. And so the general view is like, once you understand and uproot those causes, what greater healing is there than that? That's, of course, a bit more Buddhist understanding of healing, but I think that level is, of course, a little different than only speaking of it in the physical aspect or the referring to some specific mental illness or physical malady.
Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, no, this is a really, I think, important issue. It's an intersection that's a real interest of mine. You know, for this occasion, I presented on a practice called Tummo, and there is a 13th century Tibetan who's named Yangompa, a yogin and sort of theorist, if you will. And he wrote several texts on Tummo that I've been reading, and in one of them he says there's four reasons or 4 sort of possible outcomes for this practice of Tummo. He says the first is to quell obstructions and hindrances that come up, right? To make things go a little bit easier in your experience. The second, he says, is to cure disease, right? To overcome different types of diseases or sicknesses. So it's kind of a preventative practice, right? But also curative and remedial. And then the third, he says, it's to quell or sort of pacify upsetting emotions, right? These nyongmong or klesha, upsetting emotions. And then he says, fourth, the kind of ultimate tumo, which most people associate with, is to recognize or realize non-dual awareness, this sort of mahamudra. So it's interesting, though, that the first three out of the four for this practice that's typically completion stage practice are articulated as being really for health benefits or sort of mundane benefits. And I think that it's important to look at the sort of broader contemplative literature and practice traditions and the living traditions that have emerged, to articulate these practices. We see, again, in the materials that I'm looking at, not only practices for sociological means, for sort of progression along the path, but practices for overcoming physical ailments. Practices, there's a whole genre called geksel, or these pacifying or sort of quelling these obstructions. There's a whole other kind of sibling genre called bogdon, where you enhance your performance and so on and so forth. And these are really contemplative interventions for health and well-being, cultivating resilience, overcoming all sorts of ailments. And they're practices that are performed, many of them breath practices, many of them visualization practices, many of them somatic yogas or kind of body movement practices, in order to become healthy, right, in the kind of very mundane way. And if they say, if you're not healthy, if you don't have the kind of baseline kind of homeostatic health, then, to even go into the other practices for other reasons, transformative reasons of other kinds, soteriological transformations, is really not even possible. So there's a kind of baseline health that not only is recognized, but that these practice traditions promote and actually, again, have prescribed practices and techniques, technologies, if you will, to enhance them. Yeah.
All right. Any other thoughts on this question before we move to the next one?
I pretty much agree. I never thought of the physical health benefits and the psychological, spiritual benefits as being separate. I thought that these techniques were all working on the different levels simultaneously: physical, physiological, energetic, psychological, spiritual as well. And then having said that, I'll circle back to the first question. When I'm working as a therapist in a clinic, my primary responsibility is to reduce the patient's pain level. Ideally, they want to know if I can do that in the next hour. So my responsibility is to reduce their suffering. Teaching them about the cultural, historical context that the technique comes from is secondary. But then when I work as a continuing education provider, I think it's very important to provide the historical, cultural context for those students. So I would say it depends on the audience that you're addressing, which way you need to emphasize.
Yeah, thanks for that. Roni, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Anne.
Yeah, just very briefly, and a very basic point, but an angle that I think can be useful to look at is the angle of transmission of knowledge. So this is something I've been working on more broadly, to think about what knowledge moves and what knowledge doesn't move, which knowledge moves fast, which knowledge moves slow. And in this question, so the ideas of breath for healing, they move fast and easily. And then the religious ideas may follow or not. But it's about, speed of movement. So we need to think of them as moving along the path, with the healing ones moving faster across cultures.
Yeah, and I can't resist saying, just from my own research, that the healing leads the way and then pulls the religious, interest towards the religious practices in many cases.
Yeah, exactly. As we were, discussing a bit before, but yeah.
Yeah, great. Anne.
Yeah, definitely building on that, the health and soteriological. I mean, I think one of the advantages of understanding history and understanding more granularly the contemplative traditions and oral traditions around them is to see that for all of the distinctions that we can make between the health and, let's say, religious, there's also an important way that at least in Tibetan culture, they're not completely different. The fundamental principle in the Tibetan medical system, as you probably know, is, it's a system of balance, balancing the elements, balancing the three main ingredients that contribute to illness. And balance is really important in meditation too, obviously, at a lot of levels, energetically, conceptually. There needs to be some understanding as well as experience. And when that comes into the process of cultural transmission of knowledge Renee was talking about, it seems like it's very significant also to make a distinction between, for example, psychological health and the kind of settling or relaxation that is enjoined in traditional descriptions of meditative goals. And it seems very true, as Michael was saying, that there is some baseline health, there's some baseline mental, we would call, the West might call psychological balance, and they're not the same, but they do speak to each other. And in many cases, in the West at least, practicing even in a traditional context, one needs psychological support. One needs to confront, childhood issues and so on as part of setting a foundation in place. So the relations are different, but they talk to each other. And that seems, understanding that seems to be one real advantage of the historical, the kind of in-depth understanding that we're talking about.
Great. Any final thought on this one? I'll move to the next question if not.
I'll just add one more thing from my research. I'm doing a lot of my work in very small villages in outbound Myanmar. Where there are no medical facilities, there are no doctors. There's no kind of sense of different kind, just general well-being, medical knowledge that we might have in other parts of the world. The teachings of the Buddha, and especially regarding those of breath and breath meditation, are considered medicine in and of themselves, in the sense that it's not something necessarily to be taken lightly, and that by one who engages in these kinds of powerful practices are quite potent. They have some kind of protective and healing qualities about them. So when somebody undertakes these practices, it's a part of their a part of general well-being, but also about getting rid of a disease and also helping to kind of shield themselves, to protect themselves so that it won't come again. So it's about a healing, but also as a future protective, fancy word, apotropaic, and a future of insurance, so that something doesn't come later on down the path. And so that's my ramblings at 11 o'clock at night here in Hong Kong. I definitely feel it.
Sounds like you need some invigorating breath practice right now.
Yeah.
I saw Kin nodding in response to that. I wonder, and this kind of addresses your presentation, Kin, do you have something to add to that?
I'm nodding because I like the word anthropotraic, which I can't pronounce right now because my brain's not waking up. I guess I'll add something about physical healing leading the way for religion. The presentation that Francis referred to, the community healer in the New York City area, he has a whole plethora of holistic healing repertoires. So including Qigong, including Buddhist chants, use of amulets and charms. And one of the things that he prescribes to his students is a type of religious healing when those earlier things that I mentioned fail. And what that means is a Buddhist ritual of life release to overcome the karmic causes of disease. And so this ritual is releasing life that was captured or not in the wild. And he takes his own twist on it based on his upbringing and kind of trying to lower class and working class and how he is trying to save money. And so instead of buying goldfishes or small turtles and birds in a Buddhist temple or monastery, he tells his students to breed brine shrimp. So, and he does this little calculus because brine shrimp are really cheap. And so if he does this calculus of life release per pennies, then it's kind of maximizing the karmic benefits. And so he prescribes his students to do that on the birthday of Guan Yin or Avalokiteshvara. And so here we have a healing leading the way, but the students that are not healed then start to move on to other rituals and techniques, including this Buddhist ritual, in order to find a way to overcome religious causes of their disease.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Okay, so I do want to remind our panelists that we are very much looking forward to questions in the Q&A area of Zoom from you all. And I took a quick peek down through the list of people that are here. I don't know everybody, but I do see some scholars and practitioners that are friends of many of ours here in the group that we would love to have some questions from everybody in the panel, but maybe specifically some of you all that I know work with winds and breath and prāṇa and chi on a regular basis. So the Q&A function will allow you to put a question there, and then you can vote the questions up. And we'll get started with those in a moment. Our third question that we pre-circulated to the panel was sort of a little bit of a invitation for the panelists to kind of like expand beyond the theme that any of the presentations engaged with, and to address the current pandemic. And the question was how do the breath practices and stories that many of you shared with us, how do they illuminate our understanding of the airborne, breath-borne pandemic that we're all facing right now? So just an invitation to kind of like take us, on a journey into a different direction than the conversation has focused on so far. Would love to hear some thoughts on that.
I was struck by the parallels on individual level that wind needs to keep flowing in the body for health, and also on like a larger public health issue that we need to have good ventilation in areas as well. Yeah. So that wind moving is very good for our individual bodies and also for our collective environment as well.
Yeah. And I think Saskia's presentation also brought up some of these issues of stagnant air and air pollution that kind of lend this moral quality to air or wind or moving air.
Yeah, I was thinking about the pandemic, not only because the COVID can carry more rapidly on polluted air, but also just thinking about these kind of like, how we are influencing air as as we, live and breathe and do all of the activities as human beings do. Some more than others, and how that pollution is kind of itself influencing breath practices. Breath is life. We've kind of talked about this, but yet we seem to sort of forget that it's important to keep that air, clean. And also, there's a lot of social inequalities that we can see through air pollution, obviously, as well. So,
yeah. Napakalon.
I think this question resonates with me greatly in a way that the story I share in my presentation is about the life in imprisonment and the mindfulness practice and breath. I think previously the life in imprisonment is like reserved for, certain people. But, since the pandemic started, we are all imprisoned in some ways because we are all locked down. And, there's not so many things that we could think about or do some kind of activities. And I think breath and mindfulness practice is also, an opportunity and an alternative to that. So I hope this story also illuminates us, encourage us to think about our life as well from the examples that we learn from them.
Yeah. David.
In that spirit, very much. I went through as a child what it's like to die from suffocation. In a near drowning, I was without oxygen, without breath, long enough that I lost consciousness. I had to be resuscitated. And in coming back to conscious experiencing, it was painful. I didn't yet remember my name, but the fact that anything at all was happening was a straightforward, matter of fact, wonder. And it breaks my heart to see folks on ventilators. And a response I have to the general question is how the pandemic can remind us this isn't forever. And it behooves us to pay attention to our breathing, to our matter-of-fact wonder of being alive. And of course, again, not to sound trite, but to how much it matters to care about other people. Wearing a mask is breath-related, and it is an act of compassion and regard for our fellow human beings.
I think we all agree with that. I'm curious if there's some of you I know who are involved in ethnographic work. I know it's probably been difficult to do ethnographic work, as Nathan was suggesting earlier. But I'm wondering if, as part of this question, we might talk a little bit about any of you who have witnessed or studied wind or breath or prāṇa or chi as a mode of therapy for COVID, or either for prevention or for recovery. I don't know if anybody would like to speak on that more kind of practical side of the question too. Nalika, yeah, jump in.
Hello. So it wasn't really a example of breath being used, but in the Sri Lankan context, early in the pandemic, and then this year as well, there was a kind of a practice amongst the monastic community to practice reciting the Ratana Sutra, and that the recitation of the Ratana Sutra, as historically, that was a kind of an example in which during the time of the Buddha, there was a pandemic, and then the recitation of the Ratana Sutra was a means through which to kind of bring kind of healing to the society. And so there were these large-scale mass events of monks in temples in various communities in parts of the country and nationally on the television, chanting the Ratana Sutra for 7 days or 8 days or whatever the period it was decided was the best amount of time. But I was struck at the same time. I mean, I've done my research and ethnography in Sri Lanka. I've been struck as that the tools of breath have not kind of been as significantly explored by the Buddhist lay community or the monastic community. Instead, it has been centered around the Ratana Sutra, or there have been the indigenous medicines, traditional medicines. There's a lot of kind of investments and also faith and trust in the traditional medicines or ideas of herbal medicines and things like that. And so it's been interesting to kind of see where the interest in the communities and the populations are, and at which aspects of a tradition that get picked up and galvanize people around. So air and breath and meditation could be one way, but it's in the kind of repository of tools available to communities. But at certain times of crisis, monastics and lay alike attracted to certain aspects of it. So that's kind of an interesting kind of issue to me, is like what becomes the kind of the popular or the most interesting or the most strategic or the most useful kind of approach to respond to the crisis. Yeah, so just kind of, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Nathan, maybe an alternative view from the Japanese context, or?
Sure, I can, I guess, give one Japanese and one American example. In Japan, not necessarily directly related to COVID, but in therapy and adapting the practices in hospitals and such. One of the figures who I spent a lot of time with and time interviewing and reading his materials is a monk priest named Oshita Dayan, and he's not only an abbot of a temple, but a certified music therapist. And being from the Shingon tradition, I had done a lot of training in different styles of chanting as well. And so he created a sort of chanting music therapy and combining these practices, and also working with visualizations and putting these together along with guiding patients, especially cancer patients, terminally ill cancer patients, in different breathing styles and exercises, partly just for dealing with the pain, and at times for, in at least a few cases, helping patients to get into a deep enough state of meditation with this breathing, chanting, visualization combo to actually get beyond their pain, even if temporarily. So he also then took these practices and built a training program for doctors and nurses in Japan. So it's a Ninsho, it basically translates to clinical meditation teacher program for doctors and nurses. And so he's adapting these practices just in ways to teach these clinical workers how they can incorporate extra practices within their medical practice and kind of try to listen better to patients, and then work, if patients are open to it, of course, work in these extra contemplative practices, if those breathing exercises and such might help the patients. But he actually built in a 4-stage certification process with different types of contemplative practices.
Great.
Maybe spoke too long, so I don't know if I should still say the American example or not. But I guess briefly speaking, one thing I've been hearing a lot from chaplains in COVID wards and chaplains serving in hospitals is just the extreme exhaustion of medical workers right now. And so one of the big things where breath work is being applied and visualizations in these other exercises is also just in the care for caregivers, the doctors, nurses, and other chaplains themselves. One of the kind of interesting ones I heard about was a application of mandala work into the actual setting of the hospital. So depending on how a person was feeling that day, a nurse could come in and get the red card that would remind them to focus on a certain trait or quality they needed, based on a color, like, oh, need more compassion today, need more perseverance today. And they linked these colors and practices of the mandala to a visualization and kind of basic mantra practice of patience, 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 while walking through different parts of the ward. And so it was also a very kind of embodied within the building type of practice that I found really interesting, just as a form of caring for the workers themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Anne, and then Michael, we'll just finish up with these last two comments, and then I do want to open the floor because we are now getting questions in the Q&A, so please.
Jigme Lingpa, Tibetan, says that in one of his wisdom chats that the essence of speech is breath, rlung, prāṇa. He uses the Tibetan word rlung, and that opens up so much for breath. And since you mentioned a Tibetan community that I'm connected with in Tibet, when COVID landed, they found a song that is attributed to, we're not entirely sure, we think it's understood to be a revelation from Guru Rinpoche. And it's a very, very lively melody. I could send it to you, Pearson, and we could post it on your website. And it says, it's just very short, a prayer song to pacify the diseases of these times. Sickness scourge we can't cure, dre ho, stricken with pain of black-white blood plague. So black-white blood plague, a friend of mine inquired, maybe you knew this, but I didn't. White disease combines wind and phlegm, so breath, a form of breath. Black disease is even more potent, combining wind and bile. So we just have here a little trope of, breath, which is the essence of speech. So you're singing a song to purify, and at the same time, it's implicated in the disease. And the tune is particularly lovely, as I said. So I'll post it for you to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gives me the opportunity to just tell the panelists if there's any kind of materials that you want to add after the conversation today, links or little video, audio recordings, whatever. I'm quite happy to add them to your page, that the page that introduces your presentation and that has your presentation recorded. We can add them there in supplemental materials or something like that. So Michael, I said I would finish this question off with you. Some final thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, that was really great. And thanks for sharing that. I love that. This question rose in my mind some kind of personal reflections over the last period of this pandemic. And I'm sure, it's shared with others. I know people I've been speaking with have had similar experiences of friends or family members, people who are connected to in close ways, having some kind of respiratory issues, particularly, of course, because of COVID and people getting sick, people dying because of COVID, which is, primarily respiratory. But then there's also, I think, if we look in the broader world, this question elicited to me, there are these personal instances. I've had someone very close to me pass away in the last year because of a respiratory illness. But then, there are environmental, it hasn't been said, but to say the obvious, or it's been in some of the talks, there are, environmental factors here that are contributing to respiratory issues of all kinds. And how do we address these? And even more so, George Floyd's sort of public cry, "I can't breathe," right? There at the beginning of the pandemic, as a sort of slogan for this kind of historical moment, at least here in North America, that we're very much embedded in and situated in, that we live in. So all of these factors, environmental, social, personal, COVID at large, have really raised the question in my mind: how do we respond, right? And at the core of the question, not to answer it, but just it's already inserted there, implicit is breath.
We should maybe record those last couple sentences and use it as our motto for this presentation. Thank you for saying that. So I was going to switch now over to the questions from the Q&A from our panel, from our attendees, and start off with a question from Rose, who's been waiting for a while with this question. And Rose asks the panelists if there are practices that we individually or collectively, as historians, academics, researchers, practitioners, et cetera, are practices that we can see as realistic ways to broaden our communication with the general public, to get out of our bubble, so to speak, so that the knowledge that we're talking about here, the perspectives, the broader perspectives we're talking about here could benefit the general public, sort of right on the subject that Michael, you were just finishing us off with, to help us, to help us culturally to reduce fear of the other and respect cultural literacy. We, I think, touched on this a little bit at the beginning, and Kin, you kind of like pointed out the blame of the academy maybe for being a little bit too isolated in our ivory tower. I think what Rose is looking for, though, is more like concrete or practical, methods or practices. So I'm wondering if we could spend a little bit of time thinking about that as a group. How can we more concretely put knowledge out into the public sphere, and how would we envision that changing society if we were able to? I'll go ahead, Ken. Yeah, please.
I think something like this, right? When I hear practice, I'm thinking of this webinar that's free to the public, and what Francis is doing on the YouTube channel for University of Toronto and Robert Ho Foundation, and these clips being made public on websites, and also other ways to kind of engage with a wider audience. So I know, Pierce, you write on other, I guess, more popular media channels, podcasts, right? So not being afraid to speak to broader audiences, but of course we have to acknowledge the institutional pressures that we have as academics. I'm speaking for myself, that I have as an academic who just submitted my tenure application 2 days ago. The pressure is publications. Right? So publications to secure your job and get a raise and promotion. And the publications that count are peer-reviewed publications that speak to other academics. And so how can we, in the in scholarly context, kind of change what gets rewarded in scholarship to encourage these practices, encourage more podcasts, more YouTube channels, maybe some TikTok videos and Instagram, other ways to reach broader audiences.
Yeah, David, go ahead.
I'm retired now, but worked for years as a sitting teacher, facilitated a contemplative practice group. So that's direct engagement, sharing, conversation, practice. I'll offer tongue in cheek, I also provided some education to the legal system of the state of Texas when they informed me, despite having 3 grad degrees related to the study of religion, I didn't know what religion was. And having set up a religious group which didn't require a belief in a supreme being. So I had that opportunity to go to court and share some perspective on the range of spiritual, healing, contemplative practices. I've also been asked to speak a number of times, university courses, including, to my surprise and delight, the business school. They want their students to know how to take care of themselves, including working with the breath in mindfulness exercises.
No, that's an interesting sort of like bringing it back around full circle to when Ronit was earlier talking about the sort of the healing knowledge circulating quicker than religious knowledge. And maybe healing is our in, maybe medical knowledge is the in that makes the general public more interested in our work in religious studies. That's an interesting point. Thanks, David. I saw, Nalika has raised her hand.
Hi. I wanted to kind of jump on piggyback on what Kim was saying about the constraints of academia. I work at a research center and I'm not in an academic faculty position. And the way our research center, our mission is to do this kind of work of engaging with the public, kind of translating between communities and faith communities, government, and things like that, talking to the public, sharing our work in all kinds of ways. But again, it is limited and restricted by funding and by foundations, by centers, by different kinds of grants. And so again, there is this kind of limit our ability and capacity to engage on these topics with the public is also kind of constrained by our funding opportunities to do that allow us that kind of to do that kind of communication work. So on the one side, there's what Kim's talking about in terms of how academia constrains the ways we are able to share our work and what is recognized and what's legitimate. And then there are centers that are kind of, the work is geared towards engaging the public, but that's also constrained by the funding that we are provided to do this work. So there must be, in a way, some kind of place in between in which the economics of academia in the different ways, in the different spaces can be navigated for academics to be able to share this work.
Thank you. Anne, I saw your hand go up and then go down, and then I saw that you put a comment into the chat. Do you want to bring that into the live session here too? Or?
Yeah, listening to Kim, I'm thinking, I think this is changing. I hope so. And Francis has chimed in saying that it's a duty of those of us who have the capacity professionally to try to contribute something to the public conversation. I think that's so important. And I do think that the public intellectual idea is getting more clout. And I remember being at a conference at the Ford Foundation, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, and an activist scholar was talking about how she just couldn't get any respect. She was working in the labor movement. And I just think that's changing. Social justice is clearly an orientation for the humanities. Humanities are dying to get more respect. I speak in an institution which is heavily STEM, and this is just necessary. So maybe it will change, maybe not quite in time enough for your tenure review, Kim, but you can be at the forefront once you get your tenure of, this needs to change. And this seems to be a moment because we're in crisis.
Yeah. Any final thoughts or comments on this one? Okay, so Nathan, were you going to say something?
I guess I could just briefly mention a project I'm just finishing up right now, which provisionally called Refuge in the Storm, Buddhist Voices in Crisis Care, and collected essays from about 27 different authors. And they're coming from about a dozen plus different Buddhist traditions and various professions. And some of them are, a number of them are not native English speakers, and a number of them haven't published before, but they have this great experience in the field and wonderful stories to share. And so just trying, like, through this project, like, to get those different voices out and say, like, hey, here are a number of different methods used in the field, in practice. So it's, I guess, just one way, trying in a little bit to help bring some of these experiences out into the public.
Yeah, great. Great, thanks. Maybe you can add that as a supplemental item on your page too. So yeah, so any final thoughts on this question? I'll move to the next one. All right, so we have a question from Bill McGrath, who some of us know as a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism and medicine. And I know where Bill's question's coming from because he and I have discussed this very question for years. He wants us to go back to the previous conversation that we were having, where we were talking about the relationship between religion and medicine, or religious versus medical approaches to wind and breath. And to think about what advantage is there to studying the overlaps. I think a lot of us mentioned kind of the overlapping nature of those discourses versus studying them in isolation. Are there things that are revealed when we study, say, Tibetan medicine and Buddhism separately, which I know several of the presentations talked about. So should we maybe maybe have a little conversation about that with Bill? Maybe I can invite Bill to join the conversation as well as I think I can turn his mic on if he's willing to join us. But did people have thoughts about that? Yeah. Here he comes. Bill, are you here? Maybe he took a break right when we called on him. We'll discuss his question anyway. Go ahead.
I think it's interesting in the Mongolian context. I don't think these things can be separated at all. So I think that, if you're with HEMA, it's kind of, you might go and ask for a prayer to be read for apotropaic purposes, but the intertwining of health and like medical and religious perspective is too tightly interwoven to be kind of separated out, if that makes sense. I'm sure other people find this in their field. I'm not sure that there's kind of a distinct separation between these things in how people explain these notions to me, at least.
Yeah, Ronit.
I think, of course, it's advantageous to study them together, but it's a question of the audience and the openness and the possibility to hear. So, as we said before, like if there's only openness to hear the healing side, then this is all we can do. You spoke earlier about the difficulties in various places in America to even talk about yoga in any kind of terminology, any kind of Asian terminology. yeah, so when there is an openness and a possibility, it's of course advantageous. And I'm really curious actually to hear also what Bill has to say about it. But as we said earlier, sometimes we can only take one path, and just be satisfied with the fact that the one path might open the door to the other path. That's all I have to say.
Susanna, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in the Tibetan context, as obviously a lot of you will know, that we have this one Tibetan term which conflates two concepts that came from India, from medical and tantric traditions. And because they're overlapping, but not exactly the same in certain respects, when we start to talk about the different channels that the wind, flows through, in the tantric presentation and in the medical presentation, depending on people's level of knowledge, kind of rlung or wind may be taken to be one thing or two things. So there's, for example, a difference in the way that lay people talked about wind and, say, the central channel and the various wind channels in the body, and the way that medical or tantric specialists talked about these with more knowledge of those problematic kind of overlaps. So Jeffrey talked a bit in his presentation, his recorded presentation, about this, and Francis has written quite a bit about these debates that have gone on for centuries about how much are we talking about the same thing in these two different traditions. And I think, other traditions will perhaps have more separation, but in the Tibetan context, it's particularly complicated by that particular, kind of one word being used essentially across two traditions.
Yeah, great. I think we have Bill with us. Sorry, Bill, I was trying to get you in here as somebody who's able to talk. Are you able to join us?
I can talk. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. So I don't know if you wanted to, if you wanted to restate your question or talk a little bit more about your research in that area, or just contribute to the conversation in some way. We'd love to hear it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for giving me the microphone, and thank you for entertaining the question as well. I appreciate the responses I heard. Ronit seems to have disappeared from my screen. I don't know if she's still here, but yeah. And of course, Susanna's comments really, hi Ronit. Susanna's comments are exactly what I had in mind as well. In some ways, as you've already reflected, wind really sits between body and mind, between religion and medicine. It sits right at this border that I think at least for many of us, in our usual mindset, the mindsets of most of my students, and even my own mindset, most of the time I have this separate body and this separate mind. But of course, wind really challenges that. And so that's really what inspired the question. It's just wind really is this point at which so many different facets of our life and our being come together. And I wanted to hear your reflections from all of your different backgrounds, historical, clinical, anthropological, whatever background you might have, to just reflect on, should we, I guess I tried to put it in terms of benefit, or I think Pierce said advantage. What is the benefit of separating body and mind, religion, medicine, so forth, and what is the benefit of studying them together? Because I think really, as maybe these larger conversations show, it's a choice, right? It's a choice that we all have to make in designing our studies.
Can I just add to that too, that it's not only body and mind, but individual and collective. And so that's another choice that we're making, or another thing that we could elide. And so you mentioned, having here academics, historians, clinicians, and so forth. But I realized what we're missing is an atmospheric scientist, or someone who, studies wind from this kind of global atmospheric perspective. And that would be that's kind of the missing piece here. That would be really interesting to hear such a person discuss this question. Although there's Saskia, who talks about pollution, which is similar.
As a psychotherapist, I'm reminded of how many different approaches, frameworks there are. I was trained psychodynamic and humanistic, and worked for years in a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy clinic, and was impressed at how well that worked for certain presentations. And I'm also reminded, of course, of how the word medicine can be applied in some cultures to a person, a shamanistic approach, where it's just not divvied up conceptually the way we moderns do between what is spiritual growth, healing, what's medical. Both Susanna and I believe earlier Thomas speaking how in some parts of the world for many centuries, the monks were the doctors. They were educated and they had the sort of healing perspective. It makes sense to me to have a conceptual categorization of different techniques, different technologies that work with different conditions and presentations. But to speak personally just a second, I was told as a religion student at Harvard Center for the Study of World Religion that my interests would be better suited in a psychology program because they were focused on the experiences that mean most to people in their lives. And as I'm turning in my dissertation for a clinical psych PhD, I was informed that this would be better suited in a religious studies program because it was focused on the experiences that mean most to people in their lives. How we divvy things up conceptually is, of course, to my mind, sort of trademark of the modernist, especially Western perspective. But if and when we look to the very basic questions, how does this work? What does this put me in touch with? How is this beneficial in healing? That to me always seems to be the touchstone, the place to go. And whether we call it medicine, whether we call it religion, those discussions we can have in addition to that focus on what works and what is beneficial.
Yeah, I guess I'll take the opportunity to beat the drum that I have been beating, and just to say that Win to me is an inherently post-disciplinary topic or transdisciplinary topic, right? As we're seeing here by bringing together people from psychology, practitioners, anthropologists, historians, et cetera. We definitely benefit from the disciplinary specializations that different people have and this deep study that they do through those different lenses, but then bringing them together here is for this conversation is really, really, really critical in my mind. Nali, raise your hand. Nali.
Hi. I really appreciate the conversation and speaking to what David was just mentioning in his own experience. I've been reading the work of Bruno Latour. He's an anthropologist in the science, anthropology of science and SDS kind of work. And his, We've Never Been Modern is one of his key works in which there is a idea that he talks about in which the nature cultures in which the moderns kind of constructed this binary of the nature versus culture. And that, there's this idea that moderns have now separated those two away from the pre-moderns, but that in fact, even moderns are like nature cultures are not separate things. And you can see this in the way scientists operate in the lab and things like that. And he applies that in many ways to all the other binaries that are produced as a result of modernity. And so I've been this is not really a response, but more like a question that I'm myself engaging with. And I appreciate this question because it speaks to this, how is it that, that these things like religion and health or medicine, and these things are not really actually separated, even in the way the moderns operate. We may perceive that there is a difference, and maybe that is the claims that we make to our modernity. But in what actual ways are those differences blurred in our actual lives and the ways we practice? Yeah.
Thank you. Any final thoughts or comments on Bill's question here? Saskia.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, as well as breath animating, like it's kind of like that moment of consciousness. it also interconnects. So it's kind of like good to kind of look at those. Everyone's kind of work is about this anyway, but just to remind ourselves of that, those two things.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have another question in the chat, which is from Jesslyn, who says that they're fortunate to have seen and felt healing from some of the practices that we've been talking about here. However, they would love to know more about healing traditions outside of Asia. Has anyone here done research on healing modalities referenced in historical texts and seen in cultures outside of Asia? Perhaps particularly within the Judeo-Christian tradition is what they're asking about because of the majority community that they serve. So I think everyone here is sort of a specialist within the Asian context, but in your research and your work, have you benefited from any comparative glances at other traditions, or do you have experiences to share that might be useful for us to talk about here? Nalika, yeah, go ahead.
I'm not extremely familiar with this world, but I do recognize that within the African American tradition, there is both Christianity and the gospel tradition of healing, Pentecostal healing practices. And at the same time, there is amongst a lot of young African American activists and people of color, there is a turn to folk traditions or Yoruba traditions, a lot of the kinds of like Black Lives Matter activists on the ground, drawing on, Black traditions of from Yoruba and Ifa in particular that are being used in the activist context as well. So that's just some background, a little bit of knowledge on that.
Yeah, thank you. That gives me the opportunity to just mention that the journal Asian Medicine is coming out in about a month, a couple weeks, a month at the most, with a whole issue dedicated to the the Black activist origins of acupuncture in the U.S. So this is very much a subject that is underrepresented in our field of Asian medicine, Asian studies. So I think that, Nalika, you're pointing towards a whole area that is really deserving of a lot of further study. So thank you for that. David, you were the one who mentioned earlier the cloud of unknowing and the Christian mystic context. So,
right. And for the cloud author, he's mostly focused on how to meditate, or in his word, how to do contemplation. And so he's going to have a more, in our language, psychological approach, but he's appreciative of psychic distress and disturbances. He recommends when his word is ghostly, which would translate as psychological. When ghostly distress comes up during meditation, you have a couple of techniques you can use. One is to ignore them. In his image, to look over their shoulder to something more original, something more basic, something more fundamental than these adventitious disturbances. And if that doesn't work, let go, let go, let go. Consider it's there for a reason, let it have you. And he describes a sort of cathartic process. In his language, take good keep of this slight, I pray thee. Pay good attention to this technique, I urge you. For methinks with the practice of it, thou shalt melt all to water. Let whatever's coming up, face it, engage with it, look at it. If the previous practice of looking past it doesn't relieve you of whatever it is that's coming up. So just one example of attention to ways in which meditative process and psychological unfolding or healing, they're of a piece. And historically, across cultures, contemplatives have typically paid attention to both the sort of what we might call self-actualizing spiritual growth side of things, and also the taking care of your mind and heart, the healing aspect in those arenas.
Great, thank you.
Just a note, David, on your point here, it sounds very much, your description, like what's called exposure therapy in the psychological literature. Yeah.
So do we have any final comments on this question? Ronit, yes, you can have the last word.
So not exactly practices, but ideas that are that I found really similar to the Indo-Tibetan ones. I'm working currently on an ancient Hebrew medical text that talks about winds, 4 or 5 winds that I find really similar to the 5 Tibetan winds. And Jeffrey Samuel mentioned in his presentation the concept of ruach and how well, there are a lot of similarities that come into mind when you look at these ancient texts, but we still need to work on them and mine them for those kinds of at least connections and ideas.
Great, yeah.
So stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. Well, and speaking of staying tuned, we have just a few minutes left in our time today, and first of all, I just want to really thank everybody for just a really interesting and productive conversation around this topic. And we were thinking about throwing out this question to you all as in terms of sort of next steps or future ideas, and for pretty much for all of the Asian traditions that we've been studying and talking about here, breath or wind is normally paired or combined with at least three other elements. And so we were wondering, we'd like to, hear your thoughts on this, if it would be worthwhile to do an event like this that focused on earth or fire or water, or maybe even space as well. Or is there something uniquely special about wind in the way that Bill was talking about it, sort of, sitting at the intersection of so many different aspects of humanity? Is there something unique about wind that makes it more conducive to this kind of conversation, or what are your feelings on that? Should we organize the Buddhism and Fire Summit? Buddhism and Earth Summit? I could see some interesting topics coming up, but what do you all think about this?
I'd be interested to hear about Buddhism and fire, especially given the fires, the connecting it, keeping this connection to what's happening on the planet, and
Buddhism and Earth would be an ideal forum for that subject, Saskia. We'll have to invite you back.
They're all really interesting. I wonder if a single conference could have space for, the dialogues among the elements, or if you want to stay focused on a single element. Either way could work, but just in this conversation, when you think of fire, you would also think of air, and as you said, earth. I will say that one well-known Dzogchen master, Namkha Norpa Rinpoche, once said that air is not like the other elements. And he didn't explain it, but I've always remembered that. And I think that partly because it's associated with every kind of movement, which is everywhere. I don't know, just throw it out there. Maybe you'll figure it out. Mm-hmm.
And for me, a favorite archetypal image on the verge of his realizing awakening, the Buddha is accosted by various forces and demonic distractions. And in response to their question, by what right, on what, by what authority do you purport to become awake? He just reaches down and touches the earth. Just getting real, just getting grounded, just getting underneath the distractions.
This was an idea that I started thinking about a few years ago. And so I taught I was going to do a series of courses, one on each of the elements. So I taught the breath one before. And then this semester, I took an administrative post, so I couldn't end up teaching it. But I did propose, and someone else is teaching a course called Touching the Earth. So that was the earth course. And then water and fire, I thought I had to wait until the pandemic was over because I didn't want to do those online. I wanted those to be like live courses. Not good to tell your students to go like experiment with fire with no supervision. But I do wonder though, Anne, I wish we could ask, whether it's the case that people would say, Tibetans or other Buddhist masters would say that there's something special about wind or air.
I think he was talking about green Tara in that moment. And so it might have been context because, of course, Tibetans talk a lot about space as a very special element, and really everything occurs in space. So it's hard to imagine that there isn't something very special about each of the elements.
Yeah.
It's a very exciting idea, however you configure it. I'd love to hear more. I might ping you to get some of the bibliography for some of these courses. It sounds fantastic.
Michael, you're going to jump in?
So I love the idea of 5 elements. I didn't respond to Bill's question, but someone else did in a similar way. I had in mind of, there are these two terms Susanna mentioned in Tibetan. And when I first encountered these translations of like, oh, this is wind, I was like, no, it's breath, stupid. It's breath. It's not wind. But over the I thought it was very kind of clumsy, parochial use of the translation term in English. But over time, I've really started to appreciate the dual nature of how wind makes sense in particular context as much as breath does, in the sense of there are these external, or meaning outside the body, that we take in, right? There's this constant inhalation, exhalation, and these are winds, like there are winds in the air and the atmosphere. And, the practice I did for this occasion was Tumo, and it says the same about fire. And if we look at these there's some very early kind of tantras that come from India that really emphasize 5 element practices within the Dzogchen tradition. The Kala Chakra tradition that I'm very interested in is constantly talking about macro and micro, about how the individual and the collective are essentially reflections of one another. And they do so in a discourse around the 5 elements over and over and over again. So there's really, I think, rich materials there to be had within the Buddhist traditions. And I'd love to see a sort of like, double click and see all 5. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's so great for teaching also because it's I do a lot of experiential learning and that kind of teaching. So they're both like all of the elements are things that we experience with our bodies. They're what our bodies are. If you think of earth as being solidity and so forth. But then they're also ways of connecting our bodies to the environment. And so in a day when like most of my teaching has some kind of climate awareness, climate change awareness component to it. So that also makes that very natural connection.
Okay, so nobody be surprised if you get an invitation to come for the next summit, Buddhism and Fire, Buddhism and Earth. Kin, we'll give Kin the last word. We're going to wrap up in a second.
I like to think of language as ways to understand and divide and carve up the world. And so in English, it makes sense to have wind and breath carving up the world in a different space. In English, that makes sense. But in Tibetan, lung seems to just cut across in a different way that encompasses wind and breath. And I think that's very useful to remember.
Great. Kin, you were the first to speak and you are the last panelist to speak as well. So thank you for your contributions, Kin, but also thank you to everybody else for all that you've brought here, all the perspectives that you've brought from different fields and different geographic and temporal areas, different perspectives, different ways that breath and wind and qi and prāṇa and lung have really moved through your own lives. And thank you for sharing that with us today. And this recording will be up on jivaka.net in perpetuity. So hopefully many other people will have the opportunity to share in that. So I really thank all of you very, very much. And I'm sure Frances wants to also say a few last words. So I'll pass the mic over to her.
All I wanted to say was I noticed that Sam has just made a comment in the chat there. Sam is a student at University of Toronto who did all of the transcription for all of the videos. So maybe we can thank Sam for.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam.
And that's all. Yeah. Thank you all for spending 2 hours of your morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever it is for you, with us today. And this was a great conversation. And thank you so much for your resources online. And I hope that we all stay in touch.
Someone steps in front of you, someone starts talking to you, you go back, you go back, you go back. Stay with the breath. Stay with the breath. Stay with the breath. And you're not looking to analyze. Is it warm? Is it cool? Is it short? Is it long? Just sort of the fact, the presence, the institution of breath just outside the nostril.